She'd known since she was old enough to listen that her brother would always be the sun in their father's sky. It wasn't that her father was cruel to her, not outright. He didn't shout or belittle her in public. But every birthday card had an edge of caution, a reminder to be sensible. Every holiday meal came with a lecture hidden in a compliment. You always work so hard, but don't get ahead of yourself. Her brother, on the other hand, was a walking second chance. He was the loud kid who broke the neighbor's window and got a pat on the back for being spirited. The teenager who crashed the family car but got a bigger one for his 18th birthday because he needs a fresh start. When he dropped out of college, their father blamed the professors, the city, the economy, anything but his golden boy's restlessness. She watched it all happen, year after year, the way you watch an old dog favor a single pup in the litter. She worked quietly, stayed late at school to finish her homework, folded her report cards into neat rectangles so her father could see the rows of as he never commented on. When she got her first job at 17, she used the paycheck to fix the fence her brother promised he'd mend but never did. She didn't mind. Or so she told herself. By the time they were both adults, her brother drifted from idea to idea like a leaf on a breeze. First it was a sure thing import business, gone within a year, leaving behind boxes of unsold junk. Then it was an investment club with old high school friends, the kind that ended with him sleeping on the couch at their parents' house while her father talked about bad luck over breakfast. She visited when she could, always careful to keep her distance from the swirling mess of promises and half-baked dreams. She never criticized him outright, she knew how that would go. Instead, she'd slip her mother a bag of groceries when the fridge looked bare or help her father fix the roof when her brother promised he'd get around to it but never did. Sometimes, after she went home to her tiny apartment and steady job, she'd lie awake replaying the same conversations. Her father, praising her brother's big plans, dismissing her steady career with a polite nod. Her mother, quiet in the corner, too tired to take sides but always setting an extra plate for her grown son who never paid rent. She told herself she didn't want anything from them. Not really. She'd learned early not to expect praise or big gestures. She found her sense of worth elsewhere, in her work, her friends, the small savings account she built up dollar by dollar while her brother found new ways to waste the old money. Still, a tiny part of her, the child who used to stand at her father's knee waiting for him to say, "I'm proud of you," held out hope that someday he'd see her for what she really was. Not the safe one or the sensible one, but the one who kept everything standing when the golden boy stumbled yet again. She didn't know it then, but the worst part wasn't her brother's chaos or her father's blindness. It was that when the time came to split the family's future, the land her grandfather had worked for, the savings her mother had quietly protected, the house that had held them all together through storms and mistakes, her father wouldn't hesitate for a second. He'd hand it all to the same son who'd never learned the cost of anything. And he'd look her in the eye and tell her she'd just waste it. But that reckoning was still far off. For now, she did what she'd always done. She cleaned up what they left behind, folded her pride into small corners, and told herself that someday, when it really mattered, she'd stand up for what was hers. It happened on a cold Saturday morning in February, the kind of brittle, gray day that settles deep in your bones. She'd driven the familiar road back to her childhood home, not because she wanted to but because her mother's shaky voice on the phone had left her no choice. Her father's health had taken a turn, the doctors were cautious but honest, not urgent yet, but the time to put things in order had come. She found them in the kitchen, her mother at the table twisting a dish towel in her hands, her father standing by the window staring out at the bare fields that had been in the family since her grandfather's days. Her brother sat slouched in a chair, tapping on his phone like he was half listening to the grown-ups plan his next safety net. She took her seat, notebook in hand, as if this was just another business meeting, her way to keep her voice steady when the old nerves started creeping in. The lawyer sat opposite, a local man who'd known the family for decades, his expression as unreadable as ever. They went through the formalities first, small policies, the old truck, the furniture no one would want but would argue over anyway. She nodded, made notes, asked questions when her mother seemed too tired to think. Through it all, her brother didn't look up once. Then came the house. The land. The savings, what little was left of it after her father's treatments, the repairs, the debts her brother had borrowed against the future for, as her father used to say. The lawyer cleared his throat, shuffling the papers. "Your father's made his wishes very clear," he said gently, though he didn't meet her eyes. "The farm and home go to your brother. The accounts as well." She blinked. Surely she'd misheard. She flipped back through her notes, searching for the line where she'd assumed, wrongly, that it would be fair. That after years of picking up the slack, he'd finally acknowledged she'd kept them afloat. All of it, she asked, her voice small. She hated how small it sounded. Her father didn't even turn from the window. "Your brother will make something of it," he said. He's got plans. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. Plans? Dad, she stopped herself, not wanting to fight in front of her mother. She turned to her brother instead. He just shrugged, flicking his phone off like it was nothing. Like it was owed. "I don't understand," she said again, this time more to herself. What about me? The piece Grandad promised, the insurance? Her father finally turned. His eyes were sharp, but tired in a way that made her stomach twist. You don't need it. You've always been sensible. You'd just waste it on your little hobbies. She flinched at the word, hobbies. The side business she'd built on her nights off, the savings account she'd grown by skipping dinners out and taking freelance work long after her friends had gone to sleep. Her careful little safety net, which she'd planned to grow if she ever got the chance. All dismissed in 2 syllables. Her mother spoke up then, but the words were brittle, almost rehearsed. "You know we love you, sweetheart. But your brother, he needs it more." She looked around the table at the people who'd built her bones and blood. She thought of the nights she'd scrubbed floors, paid the bills her brother had forgotten, made the calls her father was too proud to make. And she saw, in that moment, how deep the truth went. She was only ever the backup plan, the spare tire they'd keep hidden until they needed her to keep the car moving again. When she left that day, she didn't slam the door. She didn't cry or plead. She hugged her mother, let her father's half-hearted pat on the shoulder slide off her like rain on stone. She climbed into her old car, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. If they thought she'd waste it, fine. She'd show them exactly what wasting looked like when she did it on her own terms. And this time, she'd make sure no one could touch it when they came running back. She drove away from the family house that day with the lawyer's words echoing in her head like an old song she'd never liked but could never quite forget. "You'd waste it anyway." Such a simple phrase, tossed at her like an afterthought, but it pressed itself into every corner of her mind during that long, silent drive home. She kept thinking back to when she was little, sitting on the back porch steps with her grandfather. He'd smell like pipe smoke and fresh-cut grass, rough hands brushing sawdust off his overalls. He'd point at the fields stretching out behind the house, the same fields that would never be hers now, and say, "Land's the only thing they can't make more of, darlin'. You keep it close, you keep it tended, you'll always have something that's yours." She'd believed him. Maybe that's what stung the most. That she'd kept that lesson in her pocket like a lucky coin, polishing it every time she stayed late at her boring job, every time she skipped a night out to put $50 more away. She'd waited for the day when she'd have the chance to tend her own little corner of something real. She never imagined she'd have to do it without them. The first week was the hardest. Her brother's smug silence as she left the kitchen. Her father's dismissive nod, the way he turned back to the window as if the conversation was already done. She replayed every moment as she sat at her kitchen table in her tiny apartment, bank statements spread out in front of her. Not much, but enough. Enough to start. She doubled her shifts at work, the one thing no one had ever handed her. She called in favors she'd banked over the years, picked up weekend contracts from old clients, said yes to every job that came her way. If she had to skip sleep, so be it. She was used to being tired. When her friends asked why she never came out for Friday drinks anymore, she just smiled and said, "I'm saving for something." They'd laugh and tease, guess it's some vacation or new car. But she never corrected them. Her dream was too raw to share. Too easy for the world to crush if she let it out too soon. She watched from afar as her brother's plans swallowed the inheritance like a snake eating its own tail. He bought shiny new trucks he didn't need, poured money into half-finished projects that went nowhere. The old house started to look worn at the edges, grass too long, paint peeling in spots no one bothered to fix. The land that was supposed to stay in the family forever sat idle while her brother figured things out. Sometimes, she'd let herself get angry. She'd curse his name in the privacy of her shower, scold her reflection for being surprised at all. But mostly, she stayed quiet, channeling every drop of that anger into the spreadsheet she updated every night. A ledger of her own, built from nothing but hours and grit. One day, she found a tiny piece of land for sale an hour away. A patch of green behind a battered old farmhouse with a roof that sagged like a tired old man's shoulders. It wasn't much, nothing like the fields she'd grown up staring at through her father's window. But it was hers. She signed the papers alone, keys pressed into her palm by a weary real estate agent who asked, "You sure you want this fixer-upper?" She just smiled. She'd spent her whole life fixing things no one else would. When she stood in that crooked kitchen for the first time, sunlight slipping through dusty windows, she felt it. The freedom. The promise. The faint ghost of her grandfather's voice saying, "Land's the only thing they can't make more of." She couldn't have the family land. But she had her own now. And she'd tend it better than they ever deserved. She didn't hear from her father for a long time after she signed the deed to her tiny patch of land. She half expected it. He didn't have it in him to call and ask how the roof repairs were going, or whether the old water pump she'd fixed herself was holding up. He'd given all his pride, and his future, to her brother, and it was too late to admit he might have bet on the wrong horse. She kept busy. Her days fell into a rhythm she loved more than she'd ever admit out loud, early mornings clearing out brush behind the battered farmhouse, late nights at her computer filing freelance invoices, short naps on a creaky cot she kept in the kitchen because she hadn't fixed the upstairs floorboards yet. Each new coat of paint, each tiny improvement, felt like stitching a wound shut with her own two hands. Meanwhile, her brother's life played out like a slow-motion train wreck. She heard bits and pieces through town gossip, the half-finished barn he'd bragged about building for a side business that never opened, the new truck repossessed when the payments lapsed, the unpaid taxes that stacked up while he posted pictures online of nights out and new gadgets he never needed. Every so often, her mother would call, voice brittle with worry. "Your brother's having a hard time," she'd say, like it was news. "Your father's so stressed. Maybe you could talk to them?" She'd change the subject, asking about the farmhouse, how the orchard she'd planted was coming along. She'd nod along politely, but she never offered to step back into the mess. She'd learned the first rule of staying free, never pick up what someone else chose to drop. Then, one evening, a sticky summer night when the air clung to her skin and the fireflies blinked lazily in her orchard, the call came. She saw the number on her phone and nearly let it go to voicemail. But curiosity won. Her father's voice sounded smaller than she remembered, like all the bluster had leaked out through cracks he could no longer patch over. "Your brother needs help," he said, skipping any greeting. She leaned against the porch railing, eyes on the moon rising over her crooked fields. What kind of help? The bank's after him. The taxes he didn't pay. He tried to remortgage the house for another loan, but the lender pulled out. His words tumbled over each other like rocks in a stream, panicked and pitiful. She stayed quiet, letting the silence fill the space he'd always crowded with excuses. Finally, he sighed, a sound that used to make her feel guilty enough to offer a solution, but not tonight. "We thought maybe you could come home." Help him straighten it out. You're good with numbers. You could talk to the bank, figure out a plan. She nearly laughed, but it caught in her throat. Come home, she repeated, her tone flat. Asterisk to the house you gave away? To fix the mess you told me I'd waste? Her father stumbled, the old pride flickering back for a moment. Asterisk, it's still your family's. You grew up there, you care about the land. She did care. She cared enough not to let them bleed her dry to prop up the same brother who'd learned nothing because he'd never had to. She traced a finger along the porch railing, the rough wood she'd sanded herself. Her land. Her work. I do care, Dad. But I don't clean up other people's mistakes anymore. She heard her brother in the background then, his voice high with annoyance, asking what she'd said. Her father's mumbled reply was a half-truth, the kind that had always kept her tied to their drama. But not tonight. I hope you figure it out, she said, her voice steady and gentle, the same way she might talk to a skittish horse. Asterisk, but I'm not your safety net anymore. You gave that away. Before he could argue, she hung up. She stood on her porch for a long time afterward, watching the orchard sway in the breeze. For the first time since she was a girl sitting on her grandfather's knee, she understood what real inheritance looked like. Not money. Not land handed down with strings attached. But the freedom to say no. It didn't happen all at once. They didn't beg her outright, not at first. But she knew her family too well. Pride was a mask they wore until the edges frayed. After that tense call, weeks went by with only silence and the occasional half-hearted text from her mother, asking how the farmhouse was coming along. She'd answer politely, but she never asked about her brother. She didn't need to. The town made sure she heard every piece of gossip. The final crack came one autumn evening, the air already sharp with the promise of frost. She was painting the barn door on her little plot of land when an unfamiliar car crunched up her gravel driveway. She wiped her hands on her jeans as her father stepped out, shoulders slumped beneath a coat too thin for the season. They stood there in the dusk, father and daughter, the orchard behind her whispering with wind. For a moment, she felt 12 again, waiting for him to say, "I'm proud of you." But he didn't. He just cleared his throat, avoiding her eyes. "Your brother's in trouble," he said, as if it were new information. She nodded, saying nothing. He shuffled his feet, staring at the barn she'd fixed up herself. Asterisk, the bank's threatened foreclosure. He can't keep up with the taxes. If he loses the house, it's the family's name on it, too. She waited, knowing the ask was coming. It always did. He drew in a shaky breath. We thought maybe you'd buy him out. Take over the place. You could run it right. Fix what he couldn't." For a moment, the old bitterness flared in her chest, the part of her that wanted to throw his words back at him. You'd waste it anyway. But standing there, paint splattered and stronger than he'd ever given her credit for, she realized she didn't need to rub salt in the wound. She'd already won in the only way that mattered. "How much?" she asked calmly. Her father stumbled over the number. It wasn't even half what the property was worth on paper, not with the unpaid taxes and the liens and the crumbling roof. She almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictably sad. She knew they'd hoped she'd feel guilty enough to hand over the money with no strings attached. But she didn't feel guilty. She felt clear. She told him she'd think about it, sent him back to his car with a bag of apples from her orchard, because she'd never learned how to be cruel for the sake of it. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, ran the numbers twice, and called her lawyer. She could do it. She could buy them out. But she'd do it on her terms, no half-promises, no "we'll fix it up together." It would be hers or not at all. The papers were drawn up within weeks. When she arrived at the family house for the signing, her brother wouldn't even meet her eyes. He wore that same smirk she'd grown up with, but now it looked thin, stretched over too many bad years and worse choices. He scrawled his signature on the line like it was nothing. Maybe it was. He'd never understood the value of things that couldn't be replaced. Her father hovered behind him, old and pale, clutching his hat like a life raft. He didn't say much, except to ask, one last time, "You'll keep the name, right?" She looked around at the walls that had once been hers, the land that had never truly felt like home until this moment. "I'll take care of it," she said softly. "But it's mine now." He didn't argue. There was no point. When the last page was signed, she stood up, shook her lawyer's hand, and walked out with the keys in her pocket, the same keys they'd once handed to her brother like a crown. This time, they felt heavy in the best possible way. Outside, she paused on the porch, breathing in the crisp air. She could already see the work ahead, the repairs, the debts, the mess she'd have to untangle. But it was her mess now, no one else's. And no one could tell her she'd wasted again. She moved back into the old family house on a Tuesday in early spring. The orchard behind her little farmhouse was budding now, green shoots pushing through the dark earth like proof she hadn't wasted a single thing they'd ever underestimated in her. She packed up her few belongings, a battered dresser, her grandfather's old rocking chair, stacks of receipts and plans she'd written late at night when the world thought she'd never own anything worth fighting for. When she stepped onto the porch, keys cold in her hand, the house looked the same as when she'd been a child sitting on those steps waiting for her father to come home from the fields. Same chipped paint. Same squeaky screen door that had slammed shut behind her 1,000 times. But this time, it felt different. It felt like a page turned to the part of the story she'd write for herself. The first weeks were exhausting in the best way. She didn't have time to think about old grudges or the sting of what they'd said, the work was too real for that. She hired the same local crew she'd used on her little farm. Men who'd known her grandfather, who remembered her as a skinny girl hauling boxes of apples bigger than her head. They didn't treat her like a girl who'd waste it. They treated her like a boss, because now she was. She paid off the overdue taxes first, one signature at a time. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like sweeping dust off a photograph she'd almost lost forever. She walked the fields every morning at sunrise, notebook in hand, scribbling what to plant, what to fix, what to tear down because her brother had built it with no plan except to make himself look good. There was satisfaction in seeing the numbers add up, slowly, steadily, honestly, not the way they'd done under her brother's careless hands. Sometimes the old ache flared up. When her father dropped by, older now, frail in a way she hadn't expected, he'd linger at the door, eyes darting around the hall like he still owned it. He'd tell her what Granddad would have done, how her brother just needed more time. She didn't argue anymore. She'd hand him a cup of tea, sit him at the old kitchen table, and let him talk. She knew it didn't matter now. The deed was hers. The decisions were hers. The future was hers. Her brother drifted through once or twice, asking for money in roundabout ways, promises tumbling out of him like loose change. She gave him nothing. Not cruelty, but not pity either. She'd bought back her piece of peace, and she'd be damned if she let him chip away at it again. One crisp afternoon, she found herself standing by the old apple tree her grandfather planted the year her father was born. Its branches were heavy with blossoms, the promise of fruit she'd tend herself this time. She pressed her palm to the rough bark, feeling the life in it, the same life that had stubbornly endured storms, droughts, her brother's neglect. Her mother came by that evening, slipping through the kitchen door like she always had. She didn't say much, but she helped slice vegetables for the stew, hands trembling only a little. When they sat down to eat, her mother reached across the table, fingers brushing hers. He was wrong, you know. About you wasting it. She smiled, but she didn't say I told you so. She didn't have to. When the house was quiet again, she walked from room to room, fingers trailing over old photos, the wood trim her grandfather had carved by hand. It didn't feel like a prize she'd snatched back from someone else. It felt like a story returned to its rightful author. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of blossoms and fresh paint. She knew there'd be more work, more storms, more late nights with spreadsheets and seed catalogs and tax forms. But she'd do it all with her name on every page. This time, no one could sign it away behind her back. No one could decide she'd waste what she'd spent her life earning. She locked the door for the night and turned out the light. Her inheritance wasn't what they gave her. It was what they couldn't take away.